Well, what keeps you up at night? I think if you were weighing in with me, you would have a list of things. One of the things that keeps me up quite a bit is thinking about the new axis of evil: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and how they are our adversaries and they do not wish us well. China, and they plan to be globally dominant by the time we get to the midpoint of this century. They look at global domination as something that's a 100-year marathon, and they're working pretty hard on it. And the US should be laying down the law with these countries and holding them to account. And our guest today, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, knows a little bit about this. He served as the National Security Advisor for President Trump. Ambassador O'Brien, welcome. Delighted to have you.
Great to be with you, Marcia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. You look at what is taking place with these countries. Biden trying to go back into the Iran nuclear deal. Biden trying to make it easy for Russia, China, and he's not holding them to account for COVID or not keeping their agreements on trade. He's talking about getting rid of tariffs. He's not dealing with US companies that continue to push products into our supply line that are made with slave labor. And of course, with Russia, you have Gazprom, which is a Russian gas producer in Iran. They recently signed an energy agreement that is worth about $40 billion. So why does Biden want to enter into all of these agreements with people that really are our adversaries?
Well, Senator, this goes back to President Obama's inaugural speech, and you'll recall this when he said, "If we stretch out our hand, we'll shake your hand if you'll unclench your fist." And there's this hope that these authoritarian regimes, that Vladimir Putin, that Xi Jinping, that the Ayatollahs, that they're desperate to be our friends, and if we just show them some kindness, they'll end their evil ways. But these are like Bond villains, and all they do is they'll pocket any kindness we give them, and then they'll go back to their ways. And so, if we take the JCPOA for example, I think that's a good place to start, because that was really the sole achievement of 8 years of President Obama. He had one foreign policy achievement, and that was the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. And when you look at that nuclear deal, what did it get us? We gave them $150 billion in sanctions relief. We gave them billions of dollars in cash just outright in exchange for hostages. And what did the Iranians do with it? Did they become our friends? Did they improve the lives of the middle class in Iran? No, they spent that $150 billion in sanctions relief on terrorists in the Houthis in Yemen, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon. They were involved all over the Middle East, Hamas and in Israel. So they used that money for terrorism. They built up their ICBM program, their missile program. They want a missile that reaches not just Israel. They want a missile that reaches Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, where I am. And so they did that. They kept their nuclear program 100% intact. I mean, we saw that because A, the Israelis got their secrets and published them. But B, we saw it recently when they just flipped a switch when they didn't like how things were going and restarted their nuclear program. So when we look at, and they took more American hostages. So we got nothing out of that agreement. It was, but for some of our friends on the left, it's an article of faith that they have to put it back in place. If we look at our friends in the region, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, the great democracy in the Middle East, they're all against the agreement. They want us to go back to what we were doing in the Trump administration, and that's putting maximum pressure on the Iranians, cutting off their funds so they can't use that money to build ICBMs and to build the drones that they're now sending to Russia and to stop terrorism. So long answer to your question, and I just use the JCPOA as an example. This sort of appeasement of our enemies doesn't work. What does work is what Ronald Reagan used to talk about and what President Trump talked about, and that's peace through strength. And that's how America stays strong, and that's how the world stays safe.
Well, you're right about that. And I think also we look at China. And some of the moves that they are making, their refusal to take responsibility for COVID, the actions that they took to lock down PPE after they knew they had a pandemic on their hands, the way they continue to try to push their spies into our country by going through soft propaganda and getting spies into our chambers and sister city programs and trying to influence elected and appointed officials, the way they're trying to get their researchers in at universities through talent exchanges. And then on top of all that, we hear that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to aggressively buy up farmland and property, farmland in rural areas and property in cities. Why is it that this administration allows them to so aggressively participate and not hold them to account? And they could. Look at what they've done to the Fed. They could hold them to account for this.
Well, again, Senator, this idea that we're allowing the Chinese to buy up farmland in America, and a lot of that farmland tends to be near our Air Force bases and sensitive operations, and put up cell phone towers on the farmland they buy to to pick up all the cell phone information that traverses the new 5G networks. The fact that we allow them to buy big buildings in our cities near where our FBI and government agencies are, it's just absurd, and we've got to cut it off. And what do they want to do with that farmland? Number one, they want to take the food and export it to China, right? They want to take our food, they want to take our breadbasket and make us the breadbasket of China. That's part of their world domination plans. Number two, they want to have access to our secrets. They want to see what planes are taking off and landing at our Air Force bases, our National Guard bases in rural America. And number three, they want to be able to exert influence on our local and elected officials, whether they be local, state, or national. And by becoming a big player, they can do so. So every time we took action against China in the Trump administration, we heard about it. We heard about it from Wall Street, we heard about it from Hollywood, and we heard about it from the gaming industry. These industries that are totally reliant on China. And so they've been very clever. They work hard, they're relentless, and they've got a plan, as you mentioned earlier. And by the way, I don't think it's any longer a mid-century plan to dominate the world. I think they've moved up the clock, and they're looking at 2025, 2030 as the time that they want to displace America as the global superpower and become the Chinese superpower. And the American people, this isn't the U.S. taking over from England at the turn of the century. This is a fundamental change in the way we live. The Chinese believe in a total surveillance society. They believe in Marxist-Leninism. When they take over the world, if they do, and they become the leading power, it's going to have a big impact on the way that we as Americans live. And just one quick example, when the general manager of the Houston Rockets dared to tweet out in support of the Hong Kong protesters, the folks who wanted democracy and didn't want China to take over their city, the Chinese brought the NBA to heel quickly. And player after player was forced to apologize and kowtow to the Chinese. It's not just that they're cutting out free speech in China. It's not just that they've got slave labor in China. They want to take away our free speech here in America. It's a challenge to our very way of life. And the more farmland, the more buildings, the more investments they make in America, and the more U.S. money that they suck out. I mean, for many state pension funds and even military pension funds, we stopped this in the Trump administration. They're sucking out 10 to 20% of your retirement dollars are being invested by these big Wall Street firms in China to build ships and missiles and planes that would fight against our kids in a future war. So the Chinese have been very effective. They've been relentless, and we got to put a stop to it. We started in the Trump administration, and I think the Biden administration has kept in place many of our policies, but they need to go further, and they need to really crack down on what China's doing.
Oh, I agree with you. I think they need to track down. And I have found it so interesting, and I've really heard from quite a few Tennesseans about this. They're concerned about the farmland. They're concerned about Chinese companies playing by a different set of rules than American companies. And they're concerned about the Chinese Communist Party trying to blackmail economists at the Fed. Yeah. And they see this as such a dangerous trend of trying to infiltrate our economy and our society.
Well, Senator, one of the things that you remember when we left office about 5 minutes after noon on January 20th, 2021, the Chinese Communist Party put sanctions on myself, Secretary Pompeo, uh, Undersecretary Keith Kroc, my deputy Matt Pottinger, because we'd stood up to the Chinese. And that really wasn't, look, I'm a lawyer. I can, I'm not planning a vacation in Beijing. I've been there before. I don't need to go back. Uh, but that was a shot across the bow to the new guys, to Secretary Blinken, to Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, saying, if you're too tough on us, we're going to sanction you. And guess what? Your friends at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and BlackRock, they're not going to hire you. Ray Dalio, who thinks, the big hedge fund guy who thinks that China has a better system than we do, they're not going to hire you because we're going to sanction you. So be nice to us while you're in office. Now, I'm not suggesting that Secretary Blinken or National Security Advisor Sullivan would be influenced by that, but that's the type of thing that the Chinese do to exert influence and attempt to control our officials. And it's really outrageous.
Well, it is indeed. And I'm one of those. I've been sanctioned, I've been banned, I've been told by the FBI that the Chinese Communist Party is carrying out a malign influence campaign against me. And you're right. That's the kind of thing they need, that they feel like they have to do.
And well, Senator, there was no one tougher that we could rely on more than in our China policies than you. And the people of Tennessee are lucky to have you because you understand the threat, but B, you're courageous enough to take action. You're not worried what the Chinese will do to you. Unfortunately, there's a lack of courage among many of our elected officials. You've demonstrated just the opposite, which is why you've ended up in the sanctions club with myself and Pompeo and others.
That's right.
And thank you for, you're still in office, so you can still make a difference. Thank you for staying in the fight, Senator.
Well, thank you. I want to ask you about being the special envoy for the hostage negotiations over at the State Department. And I know that we've all watched the Brittany Griner situation as she is being held in Russia on drug charges. And then you've got Paul Whelan, who has been detained in Russia since 2018. And then my constituent, Matthew Heath, who is being held in Venezuela. And what should the Biden administration be doing to negotiate the release of these individuals and make certain that we're able to get them home?
Well, you mentioned Brittany and Whalen and Mr. Heath, and they're just three of about 40 wrongful detainees and hostages held around the world. And, I'll never have a more meaningful job than I had when I was the hostage envoy. It was an honor to serve, and it was an honor to get to know the hostages as they came home, and it was an honor to get to know their family. And one of the things I regret having left government is we weren't able to get everybody home. I tried hard to get Paul Whelan home, and unfortunately, I failed him and his family, and we didn't get him back. I think if we'd had a little bit more time, we would have. But generally, I don't comment on the pending cases because there are people at the State Department and the White House that are working hard to bring these Americans home. But I think as a country, we have to understand these authoritarian regimes that wish us ill, and whether it's Iran or Russia or China, and China's got a lot of detainees, or they put exit bans on people's visas so they can't leave. This is becoming a tool of diplomacy. And we have to say no. And we need to make sure that ransom's not paid for these hostages. And we need to make sure when we bring them home, we do it in a manner that doesn't encourage these governments to take more hostages. And that's unfortunately what happened with the JCPOA. They paid so much money to Iran for the hostages that Iran just rationally, by the way, said if they're going to pay that much for these hostages, we should take some more hostages and sell them back. So however we resolve these cases, and they're very complicated, we've got to do it in a way that doesn't encourage more hostage taking in the future. And the other thing I tell the American people is, be careful. We're Americans. We like everybody. We think everybody likes us. We like to travel. We like to get along with folks. But when you're overseas, it doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter if you don't like the U.S. and you're traveling overseas. You don't have anything in common with these people that take you. Unfortunately, we had folks that went to Afghanistan who were opposed to the war in Afghanistan and thought that would give them some sort of freedom and carte blanche to get out of a Taliban jail, and it didn't. They view us as Americans, whether we're black, white, Christian, Jewish. It doesn't matter. We're Americans, and these some of these bad countries and hostage takers will grab us and hold us to use us as leverage against the United States. So Americans need to be careful when they travel.
Well, that is very true. And I know that our audience is going to want to keep up with you, and they will find you on Twitter at Robert O'Brien. Always, you can find me at Marsha Blackburn or our website, blackburn.senate.gov. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today.
Such an honor to be with you, Senator, and it was an honor to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.